whilst I don't have much knowledge, or a great deal of knowledge, unlike my honourable friend Senator McKim, in the property market, but I would have thought when I was listening to his submission or contribution to the debate that these provisions would act upstream to regulate or observe the flow of the money before they came into the real estate's bank accounts. So I'd have to say, in response to Senator McKim, I wasn't entirely convinced by his arguments, and I'll reflect on those after the debate. I do notice with some interest as a legislator that we are also, on Part 7, putting in provisions to dishonestly represent the conferral of police awards, which is an interesting amendment in what is a very complex and considered bill addressing money laundering and counter-terrorism. I should reflect that I've always found it of interest that some people feel they need in life to confer on themselves awards for personal advancement, and certainly I would endorse those amendments since police officers work very hard and contribute much to our security in society and our sense of safety, and their awards are justly deserved, and they should not be undermined by the actions of those seeking to improve their own standing, social or otherwise. But back to the substantive matters of the bill. I too have had to grapple with the compliance obligations associated with anti-money laundering, and I fully endorse the thrust of this legislation and the acts that came before it and will come after. It's certainly an area of law which has to be constantly revisited and readdressed. We're fighting an ongoing battle with an innovative crime syndicates who are constantly trying to undermine our regulatory arrangements. As a consequence, we must be increasingly flexible as a legislator, as a parliament, to be able to address these things. At the same time, every time we try to shut the gate, as it is to a particular innovative measure, we increase compliance costs on the industry, and those compliance costs are then inevitably passed to the client, or the Australian, or the ordinary Australian that deals with financial institutions. So we need to be also very careful and balance our response that we don't increase the costs for the ordinary Australian. The same Australian that Senator McKim was pointing out is having to, in his view, suffer from higher house prices, although I don't necessarily accept that point. So we have a trade-off, and it is pleasing to see that this legislation, if passed, will reduce the compliance costs. I know, as I said in a previous life, complying with Commonwealth legislation can obviously, in the end, be an industry in itself, and you often reflect, are you really protecting the state at the end of the day? And I think that it is I commend the government for this initiative from the basis that it's still achieving its regulatory intent, but at the same time with an eye on those that are using the system. The previous speakers in the second reading debate have not addressed the issue of privacy. This is always, again, another difficult trade-off. The more you impose regulatory burden, the more that you require the exchange of information, which you always need to ensure compliance and to restrain and hopefully stop money launderers or counter-terrorism organisations from using their monies. The more clients' individual and personal individual details have to be shared. In my understanding of this bill and my reading of its provisions, and also the submission of the Office of the Information Commissioner, it does strike the right balance between the privacy impacts, law enforcement and national security objectives. But of course, again, that is for any government a watching brief and a careful balance to maintain. The bill also targets shell banks and prohibits financial institutions from entering into relationships with those shell banks. It also prohibits the tipping off of individuals, and this would certainly apply to private client advisors or banks that may feel that they owe a greater, incorrectly and wrongly, an obligation to their client over and above their obligation to their fellow Australians and keeping law and order. There is also a strengthening of cross-border movement of monetary instruments and physical currency. Again, these provisions reflect the efforts of the government to match the innovation of the crime syndicates. Terrorism has to be financed. It's financed often with criminal activity, more generally in the world of drugs, is my understanding and my reading. So we have two effects to address. One is the actual criminal activity of drug dealing. The second is the money that comes from drug dealing has to be brought back into the legitimate financial system, and that is what we're trying to prevent. And then there is also the flow, if it does manage to find its way into the legitimate financial service system, to organisations which have ill intents and seek to take on our way of life and challenge it with violence. In my experience, this bill is to the credit of the government, and I commend it to the Chamber.